So Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 has finally been announced to be releasing on August the 18th. The thing is your PC up to the spec? I know mine definitely isn't. And no, you definitely will not be able to play it on your mum's old laptop from 2010 running Windows Vista. So, what exactly are the minimum specs for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020? As you can see from the picture shown here, you can see that the Ryzen 3 1200 or the Intel Core i5-4460 is the minimum CPU spec that you'll need to play Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. Also, you'll need a graphics card with at least 2GB of VRAM and 8GB of RAM as an absolute minimum. Also, we can see here that the game is going to be quite large, as it says you will require 150GB of hard drive space. Also, a stable internet connection is required. This is probably because of the size of the map, which is going to be downloaded off the cloud whilst you are playing. I'd never recommend actually playing on minimum specs, as the experience is likely to be not very enjoyable. Now, let's move on to the recommended specs for the game. As you can see, both CPUs, which are listed in the recommended spec, have 6 cores, both the Ryzen 5 1500X and the Intel Core i5 8400. You will also require 4GB of VRAM and 16GB of RAM, although this is the recommended sweet spot for gaming anyway. With the recommended specs, you should be able to get a good playable experience. However, this is likely to not be on the highest settings. Finally, let's move on to the ideal specs. Listed here, you will require an 8-core CPU, of which both the Ryzen 7 Pro 2700X and Intel Core i7 9800X both are. Next up, you'll require a quite high-end graphics card with about 8GB of VRAM. This could include the RTX 2080 from Nvidia or the RX 5700 XT from AMD. You'll also need 32GB of RAM and a minimum of a 150GB SSD. This will help to load your game more quickly, cutting down loading times of a conventional hard drive by at least half. With this ideal spec, you should be able to run the game at ultra settings at least 60 FPS. Did that just sound like a bunch of numbers to you? Let's now take a look at what a PC that meets the minimum, recommended and ideal specs would look like. So, as you can see, this is a list I drafted up on PC Part Picker. It includes the Ryzen 3 1200 listed in the spec, as well as an A320 motherboard. This is on the cheap side and lacks a few features such as overclocking. However, at this price point you can't really expect to be overclocking. Next up, I included 16GB of RAM. I included this because 16GB of RAM is the sweet spot for gaming nowadays. You know, you might not just be playing this game. Next up, I included a small SSD. This SSD would be good for holding your operating system as well as a few games, perhaps even Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. At 250GB, it's enough to hold the game and the operating system. Next up, I also included a 1TB hard drive. This is for other stuff such as other games, movies and pictures. Next up, I also included the RX 570. To be specific, the XFX Radeon RX 570. This one has 8GB of VRAM, so it should definitely be enough to play the game on minimum setting. The RX 570 is also one of the best value graphics cards out there. Here in the UK, this PC would cost £439 to build. Now let's move on to the recommended spec. For this, I've included the Ryzen 5 1600. This CPU is better than the Ryzen 5 1500X listed in the spec. This is paired with the ASUS Prime B450 Plus motherboard. This allows you to overclock the CPU, which can give you more performance. Again, for this build I've included 16GB of RAM. This time I've also included a slightly larger SSD to store all your games and your operating system on. Again, similar to the last build, I've also included a 1TB hard drive. For the graphics card, I've included an XFX Radeon RX 570 8GB. This is the Fatboy OC Plus model. An alternative to this could be the GTX 1660 Super. However, this is more expensive. After taking into account the case and the power supply, this build in total comes to £662. And finally, we've got the ideal spec build. This includes the AMD Ryzen 7 3700X with 8 cores, plenty enough for gaming, streaming and video editing. For the first time, I've also bundled in a CPU cooler. For this, I've included the Noctua NHD15S to keep the 8-core beast cool. The motherboard I'm using for this is the ASRock B450M. Steel Legend. This motherboard is ideal for overclocking and will allow you to get the maximum performance out of your CPU. Also, this build includes 32GB of RAM at the 3600MHz speed. Similar to the recommended spec build, I've also bundled in a Western Digital Blue SM550 500GB SSD. and a 2TB hard drive. Now for the graphics card, we've gone Team Red again, and we've chosen the Power Color Radeon RX 5700 XT with its 8GB of VRAM. Together this build is definitely the best for this game, and including the case and the power supply, this build in total comes to £1,236. That's it for this video. Please consider liking the video if you enjoyed it, or if you're just excited for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. If you want more of this content, please subscribe to the channel, and to hit 100 subs before the end of the month.